Well, kia ora, Grace City. Great to be back with you. Hey, one of our key values as a church is this. We see no line between faith and life. So one of the key values for us as a church community is that we believe that our faith should be integrated into all of life, that what we do on a Sunday should bleed into Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, that our faith is part of how we live right through the week. And that very much is part of really what James is all about. This book that we've been in for the last 6 weeks, the series that we've called Woven, is exactly that. It's about living out this value and weaving our faith into all of life. But there's a problem for all of us in trying to do that. And the problem is something that many people have now termed practical atheism. All of us struggle with this issue of being a practical atheist. What does that mean? Author Paul Tripp puts it this way. He writes, practical atheism are those moments when we think, desire, speak, or act as if God doesn't exist. So he's not saying we're atheists. We believe that God exists. We love him, we pursue him, we worship him. And yet we have these moments, as Paul Tripp just said, where we go through life as though God isn't even around. God's not part of our lives. Tripp goes on and writes this. We may not have any inconsistencies in our theology of God's existence, yet we all have functional inconsistencies in the way we live out that theology in the places, situations, and relationships of our daily lives. In other words, what he's saying is that we can believe in God, we can trust in God, we can worship God, we can love God, and then in the next minute we can forget God and ignore God as we go through our daily lives. And this is the issue that James is really writing about all the way through his letter, but he's particularly now, as he moves towards the end of this letter that he has written, he's really going after that as he moves towards the finish of what he's going to say. So today we are in the end of James chapter 4 and the beginning of James chapter 5. And there's these two paragraphs that sit side by side in our Bibles and unfortunately has a chapter division in the middle which shouldn't actually be there because they're going together. And the way we know they go together is because James starts these two paragraphs in exactly the same way. So paragraph number 1 in chapter 4 verse 13, now listen, you who say. Paragraph number 2 in chapter 5 verse 1, now listen, you rich people. And by beginning both of these paragraphs the same way, James is showing us they go together. And in these two paragraphs, he wants to speak to this issue of practical atheism. Because what he's going to talk about in this section, these two paragraphs, is two of the areas where you and I can be most prone to being a practical atheist, where we can most easily forget about God as we just go through daily life. It's what we do with our time and what we do with our money. And it's so easy with our time and money to just leave our faith behind and pursue the expenditure of those resources of time and money without a thought for God. And so here's the key question I want us to grapple with today. Am I a practical atheist in how I use my resources of time and money? Am I actually a practical atheist in how I use my time or money? As I plan my week, as I spend my cash, where is God in the middle of all that? That's what he's asking. I want to imagine today that James comes and taps you on the shoulder and he asks you to pull out that most important instrument of life, your phone. Now, the vast majority of us, this is how we live now, isn't it? Everything we do is all on our phone. We have an app for everything. And it's as though James comes along and says, hey, pull your phone out for a minute. I want you to open a couple of apps and I want to look at your history over the past week. What's the past week look like in the way you've used that app? And there are two of them in particular that he's going to pick up on. The first app is our calendar app. how we plan our week, how we lay out our appointments, how we look at what's coming up in the coming days. And he takes our calendar app, and it's as though James is going to ask us, where's God been? As you've opened that app and used that app through this last week. Now, for those of you who don't use an app on your phone, maybe you still use a paper diary, maybe you've still got a calendar hanging on the wall of your office or kitchen, maybe you use a software package on your laptop, so just go with your style, your methodology. But here's the question, are you a practical atheist in the way you plan your day and your week? See, here's what James is going to tell us as he pulls up this first app, our calendar app. Here's what he's going to say. Practical atheists plan their time with no thought for a sovereign God. That's his point. We are practical atheists when we plan our time, plan our day, plan our week with no thought of God. So here's how he's going to describe this, beginning in verse 13. James writes, "Now listen, you who say today or tomorrow, we're going to go to this city or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, make some money." Verse 14, why, you don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. So the audience that he's writing to here in verse 13 are people, business people who had the ability to travel. Now, not everyone did in the ancient world, but an increasing number of people did. This is a point in history where the Roman Empire was pretty settled. They had what they called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And what that allowed was a lot of commerce and trade and business, export and import to be happening. And so there was a growing class of people around the Roman Empire called the merchant class. They were the business people of the ancient world. And a lot of Jewish people were among the merchant class. A lot of followers of Jesus were among the merchant class. So James is writing to a section of the church, not that were kind of farmers or peasants that were stuck on their land, but people who were in business, who had some wealth and had the ability to travel for business and plan and do all of this stuff. And he's writing to them about this ability to plan. Now, here's what we need to understand. Planning is not bad. Planning's a good thing. If you don't plan life, you're going to be in big trouble. And the Bible is very much for planning. I mean, imagine trying to get work done if you haven't planned appointments or planned sales calls. Can you imagine if you're a school teacher, how chaotic the classroom would be without a plan that you're following? You know, if you've got a wedding coming up later in the year, for goodness sake, plan, please. If you're thinking about retirement, if you're wondering about an overseas trip, we have to plan, don't we? And the Bible is pro-planning. The Bible thinks planning is great. Listen to these ancient words from Proverbs 21. The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. So Proverbs are nuggets of wisdom. Most of the time, if you just rush into something, you're going to make a mess. That's basically what it's saying. But if you plan, generally, most of the time, things should work out. Later in this year, we're going to be doing a series in the Old Testament book of Nehemiah, one of the great leaders of God's people. Nehemiah is a brilliantly strategic leader who plans well. So please understand, James is not against planning. What James is against is assumption and arrogance. What James is against is planning without God as though we're in control of everything that happens in our lives. Because friends, we're simply not. And that's what he points out. He gives two reasons in verse 14 why we should never have an arrogance of assumption when we're opening our calendar app. The first reason is that we are finite. He says, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You can have some great plans all mapped out for tomorrow and everything could turn to... You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Last weekend, Rochelle and I were meant to be in Wellington. I was going to be training some preaching teams from some different churches who were coming together. I was going to preach at my old church in the Hutt Valley. We'd had it planned for months. Tickets were booked for flying down. It was brilliant. And then this horrible storm came through Friday week ago. Remember that? There were like 9-metre swells in Cook Strait, and that wind was hitting Wellington Airport. And we watched through the day as one flight to Wellington after another got cancelled until it got to our flight, which was cancelled. We had a spare weekend in Auckland. But the problem, friends, is storms happen. Life happens. I actually preached on this passage 6 years ago here at Grace City, late 2020. Do you remember what was happening late 2020? We were all in lockdown because of this little virus called COVID. And it's an amazing reminder. Storms happen. Viruses happen. Life happens. And what James wants you and I to remember, friends, is we're not in control of life. Just because you've stuck something on your app doesn't mean diddly squat. Because we are finite and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But secondly, James says in verse 14, we're also mortal. We can't guarantee we're going to be here tomorrow. We'll get knocked over by a bus this afternoon. We're mortal, friends. And I love the way he described that in verse 14. He says, you and I are like a mist. It's here and then it's gone. Rochelle and I have a beautiful border collie named Arlo. And Arlo takes us for a walk every morning. And the last couple of weeks, we've woken a couple of days quite early, and so we've headed out early. And I mean, the days, this winter's been awesome. The days have been stunning, but the mornings and the evenings have been cold. And I pulled out my beanie and I pulled out my gloves, and we're walking the dog, and we're walking along, and you can go like this. And you see your breath for just a moment, a mist, and then it's gone. And what James is saying, friends, is that's us. It's you and me. We're a mist, we're a breath, we're here, and then we're gone, and people will forget us. And when we pick up our apps or open our diaries or look at the calendar on the wall and we just assume because we've made our plans that that's going to happen, James is going, who do you think you are? You're not God. And we're playing practical atheism when we live life, when we use our apps, and God is not part of our thinking and picture. And then James doubles down on this. Drop your eyes down to verse 16 if you've got this in front of you, or look up at these next couple of verses on the screen. He writes this in verse 16, as it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Just take a minute and look at the words I've highlighted. Boasting, arrogance, evil, sin. And you're like, man, I was just making an appointment on my phone. Like, James, take a chill pill. That's honestly what I thought when I first read these verses. But James here is building again on the Old Testament, particularly that book of Proverbs. Here's what it says in another proverb, Proverbs chapter 27. Do not boast about tomorrow, because you don't know what a day may bring. That's exactly what James is saying, friends. And what he's trying to help us understand is that when we use our app or our diary or our calendar, and God isn't part of our thinking and our planning, that is actually sinful. It's the height of arrogance. Now, why is that? One commentator explains it this way. He says, to confidently plan for the future without taking into account God's sovereignty over all things is to position oneself as equal with God. When we go ahead and plan our lives ignoring God, we're playing God. And that's why it's arrogant. That's why it's boastful. That's why it's sin. So what are we meant to do? Well, James actually tells us in the middle of this paragraph, verse 15. Here's what he writes. He says, instead, you ought to say this, if it's the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. If it's the Lord's will. See the key phrase there. Now, please understand, this is not magic words. This is not like a magic formula. If you just say the magic words, then you've baptized your calendar or something like that. It's not like you have to use these particular words. If you look through the rest of the New Testament, Paul uses these words sometimes as an example. For example, he wrote to the church in Corinth in the letter we call 1 Corinthians 4. He said, I'll come to you very soon if the Lord is willing. At the end of that letter, chapter 16, I hope to spend some time with you if the Lord permits. So that's great. Then a couple of years later, he writes to the church in Rome about his plans. Here's how he puts it in Romans 15. So after I've completed this task and made sure they've received this contribution, it's a financial gift he was taking to Jerusalem, he said, I'll go to Spain and visit you on the way. Oh, he hasn't said the magic words. Because they're not magic words. It's not like you have to say these words in order to somehow sanctify your calendar. What James is talking about, friends, is a mindset. It's an attitude. It's a habit of planning our lives, opening our calendar apps, turning our diary open, and having an attitude where we're inviting God into the planning and the rhythm of our days. We're inviting God to be part of this. So how do we do that? Well, some people do use those words. They find it helpful to say, look, hey, why don't we catch up next week, Lord willing? Some people have developed the habit of using two little letters, DV. They are a shorthand version of the Latin phrase Deo volente, which means God willing. And so people will just sometimes send a text or an email. You know, I hope to do this, DV. It's just a shorthand reminder, Lord willing, this is in God's hands, not mine. But maybe there's another way for you to do this. Maybe if you have a habit of in the evening looking at your day ahead, or in the morning as you drive to work or sit on the bus and you just look through what the plans are, maybe it's just simply a matter of pausing for a moment and saying, God, here's my day. Would you be part of this? I do that more on a weekly basis at the beginning of my work week. I kind of plan out the week. These are my appointments, these are the meetings, these are the tasks I want to accomplish. And sometimes I do that and I stop and I just commit that to God. And other weeks I'm a practical atheist. And I just plan my week and I don't give God a thought. And the challenge here, friends, is to make sure however we plan, however we're looking at the days and weeks and months ahead, we are inviting God into that. We're depending on Him. And that, friends, that's the big idea that James wants us to grab. Develop deep dependence rather than forgetful independence. Develop deep dependence rather than a forgetful independence. Independence is relevant this weekend, isn't it? Yesterday was what? July 4th, Independence Day. In fact, yesterday was the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So to those of you who are American in the congregation or watching online, happy 4th of July. And there's something, amen. And there's something for Americans particularly to celebrate that. There's something in that freedom, in that declaration, and that the whole concept of liberty, which is a wonderful thing when you're talking about King George III. But the problem is that all of us as human beings, we've also declared independence from God, and that is not good. A core part of our sin nature is exactly that. We want to live independently of our Creator. We want to be God rather than have God be God. That you go back to the Garden of Eden, that was the very heart of temptation to Adam and Eve. The serpent whispers, if you take that fruit, you will not die. You will be like God. And friends, that is the drive within every one of us to push God aside and to be God, to be in charge of our own lives. Sin, at its core, is a rejection of God as God and an enthronement of ourselves as God. Can I say that again? Sin at its core is a rejection of God as God and an enthronement of ourselves as God. And our problem, friends, even when we've come to trust in Jesus and we love Jesus and we worship Jesus and we're following Jesus, there's this independent, sinful streak in us that along the way just helps us to forget God and to dethrone God and to pretend that we're God all over again. And that's why James comes to us as he's beginning to wind up his letter and says, please develop a deep dependence rather than a forgetful independence. So the first app that he asks to look on your phone is your calendar app. And then he just comes and taps you on the shoulder again. He says, could I just have that phone again? Because there's another group of apps that I'd love to just have a quick look at here. There's that banking app for each of the banks that you bank with that you can just jump on and have a quick look at your accounts. There's that online wallet that you don't even have to pull a credit card out now. You just kind of tap the phone. There's that Sharesies app that just tracks how your investments are doing. And James comes and says, can I just turn those apps on for a minute? As you look back over the last week, as you've checked your bank accounts and looked at the share market and made your purchases from your online wallet, how involved has God been in that? How much is God part of that app? See, as it comes to the banking app, secondly, he wants us to understand the same thing. Practical atheists spend their money with no thought for a compassionate God. We plan our time with no thought for a sovereign God, and we spend our money with no thought for a compassionate God. So he begins this next section, chapter 5, verse 1, with those same words. Listen, now listen. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. There's actually a big debate among scholars who the rich people are. Are these people that are believers and followers of Jesus, who's been writing to all the way through this letter, who are wealthy but have perhaps a tendency to be practical atheists? Or some scholars suggest he's so strong, and this is a strong letter, but he's so strong in this, but maybe he's writing or speaking out against unbelieving rich people who are exploiting God's people. He's talked about that a little bit in chapter 2. And it's almost like an Old Testament prophet who's speaking that way to unbelievers to both encourage the poor believers receiving this letter, but also to warn them. Either way, what he's trying to do, though, is he's trying to point out that with our money, with our finances, just as much as with our time, we can so easily slip into being practical atheists. And what he does really quickly in this paragraph, he highlights 4 things that practical atheism can lead us into. I think we can put those up on the screen. 4 key things: hoarding wealth, defrauding workers, indulging selfishly, and oppressing callously. 4 sins that practical atheism can lead us into when we leave God outside of the way we handle and manage our money. So let's quickly just read what he says here. So first of all, he talks about hoarding wealth, verses 2 and 3. He writes, your wealth is rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. Why? You've hoarded wealth in the last days. So he's writing against people who have some wealth in this ancient world, who are trying to keep it all together and hoard. So there's a couple of aspects to hoarding. One is the accumulation and gathering of everything they can. But there's a sense of trusting in that for the future. This is what I'm relying on. This is my security as I look at an uncertain future. Now again, God isn't against us planning for the future. To plan for a retirement is actually wisdom. The book of Proverbs will say, look at the ant storing up, for the future. That's a good thing to do. But hoarding crosses the line, both in the accumulation of everything for you, but also in the idea of trusting. And that's what he's talking about earlier in those verses, about all the stuff you're trusting in, your gold, your silver, your clothes, your wealth. It can all be lost. It can be corroded. It can rot. Thieves can come and steal it. And he's alluding here to the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 6, here's what Jesus said. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal. It's exactly the same, James is saying. He's not against planning for the future well, but we're to plan for the future, but our trust is to be in the Lord. So he's saying when we live as practical atheists, when we're no longer trusting God, one temptation is to hoard wealth. A second temptation is to defraud workers. Verse 4. Look, he says, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying against you. And their cries have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. It's almost a verbatim quote from the book of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. Because when wealth and the accumulation of wealth is what we're all about and God's out of the picture as a practical atheist, we're quite willing to defraud people, not pay people who work for us fairly or fully. And then thirdly, he turns around and he speaks about indulging ourselves selfishly. Verse 5, you've lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You've fattened yourself for the day of slaughter. It's about the accumulation of all this stuff, extravagant spending so that you can enjoy life. It's indulging every selfish desire and not caring for others. And then it all culminates in verse 6, what I'm calling oppressing people callously. In fact, he says, it gets to the extreme. You have condemned and murdered the innocent one who was not opposing you. Imagining someone wealthy who has so deprived the people working for them that some of them have starved to death. And James is just looking at that kind of person and saying, you're a murderer. You've let that happen. Now, when you stop and you look at this list, if we can pop this up again, these 4 sins that he's talking about, I look at a couple of those and go, well, that's not really me. I've never defrauded people. I've never, oppressed people callously. But I look at a couple of those, the sense of hoarding for the future, the sense of indulging selfishly. Man, if I'm not careful, and we're not super rich, Rachel and I, but man, my heart can go there when I'm not involving God in the way that we are managing our money as a family and as a couple. Love the way, one of my favourite New Testament scholars is an amazing professor called Dr. Douglas Moo. Here's how he summarises James here. He says, these people are condemned, not simply for their wealth. They're condemned for the sinful use of their wealth. In the Western world, he writes, where amassing material wealth is not only condoned but admired, we Christians have to come to grips with this point in James. And we have to ask ourselves seriously, when do we have too much? When do we have too much? You see, what unites those 4 sins that he highlights, when God's not part of how we manage our money, what unites those 4 things is me. A focus on me. Self-centeredness, self-passion, self-indulgence, self-desire. And it trips us up. Friends, how often do you and I spend money, and there's nothing wrong with spending money, but how often do we spend money without a thought on God? At what point does our planning for the future and for retirement cross a line into something like the hoarding that James is describing? To what extent do we end up managing our money as practical atheists? And James comes and he taps on my banking app or Sharesies app or KiwiSaver app. He says, where's God in this? How much are you talking with the Father as you deal with your money? Now, friends, again, the Bible isn't anti a level of wealth, and it's not anti enjoying that wealth. 1 Timothy chapter 6 says that God has given us what he has given each of us for our enjoyment. That's the comment. But at the same time, that passage also calls us to not be arrogant with what we have and to trust in God rather than that, and to share generously with other people what God has blessed us with. And it's finding that balance as we walk with God with that. Develop, James says, develop deep dependency instead of this forgetful independence. So as we finish, here's the question I want to ask you. If James was going to come and look at your phone for a minute, which of these areas of life are you more prone to be a practical atheist? Which of these apps are you more likely to have left God out of using over this last week? Is it more for you the calendar app? As you plan your day or your week, as you set up your meetings, as you go through life, do you have a tendency just to leave God out of the picture? And if that's the case, what do you need to do to invite God back into this? What do you need to do? Do you need to start using those words, Lord willing? Do you need to pop a DV at the end of some of the emails and the texts that you send? Do you need to make sure that as you look over the following day or you plan the next week, you're pausing and you are deliberately praying and committing this to God? Or is your tendency more on the banking app? The way you use your money, you just kind of leave God out of the picture. What would it look like for you as you make a purchase to just pause and thank God you have the ability to do that? Is there a way that you can develop a more sensitive ear and heart for opportunities where you can give money away and help others with that to keep your heart tender? Or is it simply this simple, friends? Whenever I open this app, I'm just going to pause and thank God before I move on. Whatever it is, James challenges us to leave our practical atheism behind and be people who develop a deep dependency rather than a forgetful independence. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this hard-hitting letter, the very first part of our New Testament to be written, that confronts us and challenges us and stirs us so strongly. Holy Spirit, thank you that as James wrote this letter to his scattered congregation, you were inspiring these words so that it would speak to us today. Lord, as we sit with this message, I have to confess, all too often, I am a practical atheist. I love you, I follow you, I worship you, and then the next minute I ignore you and I leave you out of the picture. And we're all guilty of it, Lord. So would you help us, all of us, to leave our independent streak behind and to develop a deep dependence on you with our time and our money. Thank you for blessing us with those amazing resources of time and money. Help us to invite you into the journey and weave a dependency and perspective on you. We pray this in your name. Amen.